Hey scholars, we're going to jump into Unit 5, Lesson 19, discussing early American politics. For your do now, you're going to look at the following 4 statements and determine if they are Federalist or Democratic Republican ideas. So go ahead and pause your video at this time if you haven't completed the do now, and complete it at this time. Alright, your do now should look a little something like this. The first statement, this country should include big cities filled with factories. That's a Federalist idea. Second statement, this country should be mostly farms, not big cities. That's Democratic Republican. Third statement, the national government should have lots of power to do its job. That's Federalist. Fourth statement, we should support France since they helped us win our freedom. That's Democratic Republican. If you're still not super comfortable with this, by the end of this lesson, you will be very familiar with these two parties. Our aim today is to prepare arguments for the Federalist or Democratic Republican parties by determining the main ideas of a text and explaining how it's supported by key details. So we'll be looking over quite a bit of text today, so get ready. All right, let's look at our first text together. Track your text as we read it aloud. The first political parties. Washington was not pleased that Hamilton and Jefferson did not get along. He warned that factions, or groups with opposing views, would destroy the new democracy, but members of Congress began to take sides in the Jefferson-Hamilton quarrel. These factions formed the nation's first political parties. Hamilton's followers became known as the Federalist Party. Federalists favored strong government. Supporters of Jefferson called themselves Democratic Republicans. They feared the power of the federal government. Party members tried to get others to agree with their ideas and choose leaders who shared their party's points of view. Soon, Americans took sides too. So at this time, go ahead and review the text and make sure that you're able to answer the question, what was the result of Jefferson and Hamilton's quarrel or disagreement? You may pause the video at this time and complete your written response. So as we've seen in previous lessons, the result of this quarrel is really very profound. We have two political parties that come onto the scene, the Federalist, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. The Federalist felt that rule should be provided by wealthy members of those higher social classes. They did believe in a strong federal government. They wanted a lot of manufacturing, meaning they wanted the economy to be based on a lot of goods that were made in the country. They had a more loose interpretation of the Constitution. All right, and as we've seen, as we've looked at the Constitution, we can see how easy it is to have different interpretations or opinions on that text. And that's been going on since the beginning. Most surprising, the Federalists have this idea of British alliance with the French and Great Britain conflict. That's really surprising to most of us because we know how much our patriots did not like Great Britain because of the Revolution. So that's a really important one to pay attention to. Federalists also believed in having a national bank, so having like standardized currency. All right, and also protective tariffs. That means that they wanted different protections when it came to trade and regulating that with other countries. The Democratic Republicans, they wanted rule by the people, that true democracy feel. Right? They wanted to have strong state governments, and they wanted more of an economy based on agriculture rather than manufactured goods. They had a much more strict interpretation of the Constitution. They wanted to be in an alliance with France during this conflict between them and Great Britain. They believed in smaller state banks rather than a national bank, and they wanted free trade between nations. So again, we're seeing a really, really big result from this disagreement, and that really is that we have the first political parties that are really starting to separate a lot of American citizens, and particularly the Congress, from one another. All right, moving on to our second text, New Presidents and Politics. Twice the American people had chosen George Washington to be their president. Twice he had served, even though he would rather have returned to Mount Vernon, that's his home. If Americans had their way, Washington would go on serving as president. Washington, however, decided that 8 years in the presidency was enough for him and for the country. He believed that if the new government was to succeed, the people must not depend on just one man. America needed a president, not a king. With Washington out of the picture, the United States had its first reed contest for the presidency. John Adams, who had been the vice president under Washington, was the candidate for the Federalist Party. The Democratic Republicans soon named Thomas Jefferson as their choice for president. John Adams won, but just barely. In those days, the person who came in second became the vice president, even though he might be from the other political party. So, Thomas Jefferson became vice president. John Adams was a greatly respected American, but he was not as loved as Washington, and while president, he had to make a decision that made him even more unpopular. So in this text, we're seeing that Washington sets the precedent of serving 2 terms for 4 years each. So the max time that a president can serve in office is 8 years. Many Americans wanted him to stay in the role of president for much longer, but your question that you need to answer is, why did George Washington step down as president? Please pause your video at this time and answer that question. This question, luckily, isn't too difficult for us to answer, and it's something that we've known for a really long time. We remember back from our Revolution unit that Americans really did not want another monarchy or rule by a king. And the text states that pretty clearly. America needs a president, not a king. What would the point be of having one person in control for the rest of his life when that's what you just fought to get away from? So the new form of government that our founding fathers created, this democracy, needed to have more flexibility in its leadership and allow for new leaders to come in after a set amount of time. This keeps power from getting tipped one way or the other, and it keeps people a little bit more honest with what they're able to do and what they want to try to achieve during their presidency. All right, continuing on to our third text. While Washington was president, Great Britain and France had gone back to war. Democratic Republicans wanted to help France. Federalists wanted to support Great Britain. Washington decided that the United States must remain neutral, which means it would not take sides. He feared that war would destroy their new country. John Adams agreed with Washington. As president, he tried many ways to maintain peace. He kept America out of war, but in doing so, he lost a lot of popular support. Federalists who wanted war turned against him. Democratic Republicans weren't going to support him anyway. When Adams ran for president again in 1800, he lost. The new president became Thomas Jefferson. By the time Jefferson moved into the White House, the problems in France had passed. Jefferson and the members of his Democratic Republican Party in Congress quickly changed many of the laws the Federalists had made. Jefferson simplified the role of government, but his greatest achievement was one he hadn't planned on at all, one that reshaped the United States. But we'll get more into that in the next unit. Since Adams and Jefferson, political parties have influenced Americans in every election. The parties have changed names and beliefs, but they continue to shape the way our government operates, for better or for worse. One can only wonder what George Washington would have to say about the precedent his cabinet left on the United States. So very early on, we're seeing how these political parties are going to impact not only the presidents moving forward, but also the state of the government in the United States. We see this conflict between Great Britain and France, and we have our 2 political parties that have formed on very opposite sides of this issue. This is going to affect how the American people, as well as how Congress, interact with the president at this time, which specifically was John Adams. The Democratic Republicans wanted to support France, and the Federalists wanted to support Great Britain. I know it's kind of crazy considering all that we know about the Revolution, but what it boils down to is they really wanted the financial support and the economic stability that came with supporting Great Britain. So it was just about the money, don't worry. So at this time, go ahead and pause your video and answer the question, how did politics shape the presidencies after Washington? Now that we've reviewed our text and are much more familiar with the two political parties that formed in the early United States, that of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, what we're going to do for the rest of this lesson is prepare for the debate that will take place in our next lesson. How you'll want to do this is you need to find which party you'll be representing in Google Classrooms. It is broken up by class, so it should be pretty easy to find. If you can't find it, please feel free to reach out to me. But there are 3 questions, more so 3 issues, that I want you to consider for this Lesson 20 debate. The first is, what is your party's perspective on their hopes for the future of America? Meaning, what do they see for America's future? How do they want America to continue to grow? For this one particularly, try to think of economics or how they're getting finances in order to produce a stronger country. The second question is, what is your party's perspective or view of the government? So again, think of the role of government here. Who wants to have a really strong centralized government? Who wants a stronger state government, and why? And the third question, what is your party's view on relationships with foreign nations? Right, this one's pretty important, right? Because this is going to impact how they do trade, how they approach wars or don't approach wars. So keep these 3 questions in mind. You'll want to go through your documents again. I've included an additional reading on your worksheet to give you some extra information on the hopes for the nation specifically. So go ahead and reread through that if you don't remember from the reading we did before spring break. Make sure you take really good notes because we are going to be using these pretty extensively for the debate. Also, for those of you that have been kind of geeking out with me during the last couple of units with the musical Hamilton, there is a song called One Last Time where you have this conversation between George Washington and Alexander Hamilton right before he's stepping down from the presidency. I'm going to include that link in your lesson resources if you guys want to check out that song. I think it does a really good job of showing how much Hamilton and Jefferson just don't get along, and how Washington is trying to kind of steer Hamilton back to looking at what's good for the country rather than him just completely being consumed by what he thinks is best for the country. So check that out if you'd like. It's one of the cooler songs from the musical. The gentleman that sings the part for George Washington just has a really solid voice, and he does some really cool stuff. His name's Christopher Jackson. So with that, I will leave you guys to it. If you have any questions, please ask me during office hours. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day and you enjoyed this lesson.